and Hannah, and we are going to walk through all of ancient Egypt. Egypt would not be here today if it weren't for the Nile River. Without the Nile River, there would be no water source whatsoever. Without the water source, people wouldn't be able to live in ancient Egypt. Did you know that the Nile River is the longest river in the world? Did you know about the Nile Delta? I'll show you. Right up here, the Delta. This is the Nile Delta. The Nile Delta was named Delta because of the fourth letter of the ancient Greek alphabet. And for many months, the banks would overflow with water. After everything would go back to normal and it would dry up, there would be a nice fertile land for the farmers to grow more crops, so the people in ancient Egypt could eat some food. Do you guys remember our trusty map from earlier? Well, I'm going to grab them real quick to show you a few things. Do you see right here, Lower Egypt? But funny enough, it's in the north. And if we come over here to Upper Egypt, which is actually in the south. How weird is that? I have a reason for that. Because the Nile River flows from south to north. They did have different kings with different crowns. Lower Egypt had a white crown called a Hadjet. See here? And in Upper Egypt, they had a red crown called the Deshret. But then one day, a man named Menes united the two places, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, and combined the crowns to make his own crown. As you can see here, called a sheet. A sheet. Isn't that a funny name? And they lived in harmony. Did you recognize me? It's me, Historian Hannah. Why was I wearing this stuff? Because today we're going to talk about ancient Egyptian clothing. First, we're going to talk about the linens. Why would they wear white? Because it was so hot there. Did you know men wore this, but it was a thing called kilts, and women would wear dresses out of white cloth. This is what an upper-class man would usually wear, with jewels and gems, headdresses, all fancy stuff like that. And this is what upper-class women would wear. Do you see the wig? That's a state of wealth. And they both wore slippers. Then you have the jeweled collar. The jeweled collar was also a sign of wealth. It would have gems, jewels, and rubies all over it. And they would have headpieces, like this one. This is a representation of hair that is beaded. They sure had some cool clothing. What was the social pyramid of ancient Egypt? This is the social pyramid that we'll be going over today. At the very bottom were slaves and servants. Slaves would mine in quarries and caves and caverns. It was the worst fate for slaves because it was so dangerous down there. Above that were farmers. They'd be working off for labor taxes most of the time. But it was a very peaceful life, and many were farmers. The majority of the population were. And above that were scribes, craftsmen, artists, soldiers, merchants, and traders. Scribes, in like the middle class and stuff, they were educated. Craftsmen would craft, soldiers served, traders would trade all over the place. Then above that were officials, nobles, and priests. Priests would hold religious ceremonies, things like that. And at the very top, there was the pharaoh, head honcho. He was considered a god on earth. How did the ancient Egyptians entertain themselves? That's a good question. By games. One of the many popular games was a game called Senet. Senet had a game board such as this, and you'd move around from here around like this, trying to get your pieces off the board. And they didn't have dice then, so you use throwing sticks, like this. I actually played it, and it's super fun. They would also play checkers and play with balls and dolls. Another fun thing to do was play with some pets, especially cats and dogs. But there was also monkeys and gazelles. Isn't that funny? Have you ever wondered why the Egyptians built pyramids? I'll tell you why. Because inside of them was a chamber, because it was a tomb. And inside the tombs, they'd have food and water for the afterlife as nourishment. And the history of the pyramids starts here. First step was mastabas, a flat building. Then it would become a thing called a step pyramid. A little fancier, but still very basic. Then, number 3, we're getting pretty fancy here, the pyramids we think of today. But there are people called grave robbers, and they tried to get into the pyramids, and they succeeded. So people started digging into caves and mountains and create tombs in there. So it wasn't so obvious. But the grave robbers still came and robbed them. Poor Egyptians. What was inside the tomb? A mummy. They believed that the spirit needed a body for the afterlife. It was preserved by a process called embalming. The process took up to 70 days. The organs were put in canopic jars, such as the small and large intestines, the stomach, the lungs, and the liver. When they were done with, they would be put on a shelf. The brain was picked out or dissolved out, but the heart, what they called the center of the mind and the body, was left. Then they'd have the body dried up, and then wrap it in linen and resin. They'd put a mask and a nameplate on for the person's name and gems and jewels. Then they would put it into a coffin or a sarcophagus, like this. And then they are ready for the afterlife. How did ancient Egyptians move from place to place? Most commonly, they would walk. Another mode of transportation they would use is the Nile. But they wouldn't swim. They would use reed boats. Reed boats were most commonly used for trade and ferrying around the Nile River. Another mode of transportation that was decently common was donkeys. Donkeys were used as pack animals to carry around luggage from place to place. But if you were rich in ancient Egypt, then you would probably use a palanquin. Palanqua? I don't know how to pronounce it. Something like that. What is a palanca, you may be asking yourself. It's one of those platforms with a chair that you'd sit in, and 4 strong people would carry you around. When you think of ancient Egypt, Do you think of camels? Did you know camels were not common in ancient Egypt, not until the end of the dynasties. Who was responsible for writing and record keeping? Scribes! Few people in ancient Egypt could read. Scribes were the most educated people in ancient Egypt. They would write on a thing called papyrus. Isn't this thing cool? It's like ancient Egyptians' paper. Here are some fun facts about the papyrus and how they would make it. They would take papyrus plant. The plant papyrus is where this got its name, the papyrus plant, and make it into strips. If you can look closely here, you'll see strips here. This is not actual papyrus, but this is just an example. They would soak the papyrus in like water for a while, and then they'd lay it in a pattern and kind of turn it into like a shape such as this. Nope, like this. So they would do this. Then they would use sugar glue. The sugar is glue. Sorry, not sugar glue. The sugar as glue, and that would stick it all together as they laid it down. Then they'd probably put something really heavy on it to keep it from folding up and let it dry for a while. Then they would take that heavy thing off, and boom, you were left with a piece of papyrus. Have you ever heard of hieroglyphics? They are pictures representing letters or an item, like this. Here are some paper examples of what hieroglyphics would look like. Feel free to pause the video to read this section. They had a shorthand writing. Instead of writing in hieroglyphics, they could write in a thing called a demotic. How did archaeologists figure out what the pictures meant? They had the Rosetta Stone. It was carved in 196 BC. They were able to translate hieroglyphics into an actual language because on the Rosetta Stone there were 3 written languages. There was Greek, Demotic, and of course hieroglyphics. That made it a big deal. They could figure out hieroglyphics was an actual language. Isn't that cool? Let's learn about some science and math. Their science was practical. Practical meaning things worked and they didn't care to know why. Mixing 2 things together and it exploded. They didn't care to know why that happened. They were like, these 2 chemicals, when mixed together, it explodes, and that's that. They were influenced by religion and superstition a lot, and they thought the brain was not important. Isn't that weird? But what about math? What about their measurements? Well, their measurements were called a cubit, a palm, and a finger. So from your elbow to your little fingertips, is a cubit. But this could be smaller than someone else's, so not very accurate. But a palm was 4 fingers to the side like this. So if something was not an exact cubit, then they would use a palm. And if it wasn't another palm, then what would they use? A finger! Just across like this. Isn't that hilarious? And their numbers. Here we have some of their numbers. 1 line means 1. 2 lines means 2. 3 lines means 3. So on and so forth. And you'd think for 10 it'd be 10 lines. No, 10 is a little horseshoe. And then here we have 100, it's a little swirl. 1,000 looks to me like a palm tree. 10,000 looks to be a finger. And you can see the rest. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how ancient Egyptians would write out 121. This is 121. See this whirly? That's 100. These are tens, and there's 2 of them. And there's a single line, which is 1. 121. What was medicine like in ancient Egypt? For its time, it was quite advanced. Papyri discovered by Edwin Smith, written in 1600 BC, explains surgical procedures. Also, Ebers Papyrus described treatments and remedies. Speaking of, some viewers submitted medical questions. Let's see how ancient Egyptians would treat this. What can cure indigestion? Good question. Let's go ahead and take a look at our Ebers Papyrus. Remedy for indigestion: a hog's tooth, crushed into powder, put inside of 4 sugar cakes, and eat for 4 days. So just crush up a hog's tooth, put in something, and eat it for 4 days. Next we have how I can cure my headache. Remedy to drive out a headache: heart of hippopotamus, poppy seeds, create ointment and smear on the aching head. Any advice for my graying hair? A dye for graying patches of hair. Dried tadpoles from the canal, crushed in oil. You go ahead and smear that bad boy on. Smear it for a while. Let it sit there. Good luck. Hope that all helps. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something new on our journey through ancient Egypt. Bye.